Welcome to the Stellar Vault. Say hi in the comments to awaken the archive. Then like, subscribe, and let the tale begin.
The storm hit without warning, the way all bad things did on Prison Moon 14. One moment the shift change was proceeding the way it always did. 43 prisoners moving in a single file line along the surface access corridor, heads down, rebreathers fogging in the cold, boots crunching on crystite-dusted ice. The next moment the sky turned white, and the wind became a physical object that hit Darian Mace in the chest and tried to push him off his feet. Whiteout. "Move!" He did not shout it. He did not need to. The men around him had learned to read him at a whisper. Mace took the front of the line automatically, the others compressing behind him, men grabbing the shoulder of the man in front in the old storm drill that nobody had officially taught them and nobody had needed to. They had learned it from the ones who came before. That was how everything worked here. The surface access corridor was 40 meters of exposed causeway, connecting the processing hub to Shaft 7's upper entrance. 40 meters that on a clear day took 90 seconds. In a whiteout, 40 meters was a white wall and a death sentence if you stopped moving. Shaft 7 sat below them. 3 levels of tunnels carved into frozen rock, worked around the clock by rotating prisoner crews extracting crystite under quotas no one consistently met. It was loud, and it was cold, and it went down far enough that a body could disappear, and the Vothrak would log it as a tunnel collapse. The prisoners knew this. The Vothrak knew the prisoners knew this. Nobody said anything about it. When he reached the upper entrance hatch, he pulled it open against the wind pressure with both hands and held it while the line fed through in front of him. 14 men. Burke Halverson was last. He always took the back because he was large enough to anchor the line if someone lost footing. The hatch sealed behind them. The wind disappeared, but its sound did not. It hammered the exterior plating above their heads like something alive and angry. Down here, the fluorescent strips along the tunnel ceiling gave everything a yellow-gray tint that made skin look like old paper. The temperature was still brutal, but survivable. Mace pulled his rebreather down and breathed recycled air that tasted of crystite dust and old machinery. Everybody whole? Nods. No one spoke. Speaking cost warmth. Thomas Weil moved up beside him. Small man, forgettable face, eyes that missed nothing. He had been on Moon 14 longer than almost anyone in their crew. He had survived by being precisely as invisible as the Vothrak needed him to be, and not 1 degree more. "Patrol," Weil said quietly. Took the Branch C junction instead of the main corridor. 10 minutes before the storm hit. Mace said nothing. He filed it. Branch C was not a patrol route. It was a maintenance access that ran parallel to the upper level of Shaft 7's eastern tunnels. Vothrak patrols ran fixed routes documented in administrative logs. Deviation from a fixed route required a filed variance request, which meant either someone had filed a variance request and not flagged it through the usual channels, or someone was moving without filing one. Neither option was good. How many? 4. Standard armor. 1 with a scanner rig. A scanner rig meant active search protocol, not a routine pass. They were looking for something specific, and they had chosen to do it during a storm, when prisoner movement would be bottlenecked and documented without requiring additional oversight. Mace looked at his crew. 14 men who were supposed to be descending to level 2 for the next work cycle. 14 men who needed to look like 14 men, thinking about nothing but the next 6 hours of crystite extraction. "Down," he said. "Standard pace. Nobody looks back." They moved. The search happened at the level 1 checkpoint. 2 Vothrak guards in gray administrative armor stepped out of the side corridor as the crew reached the checkpoint gate. Standard height for their species, nearly a head taller than any man in Mace's crew. Their secondary arms were folded tight across their chests, which among the Vothrak meant nothing out of the ordinary was occurring. Mace had spent 4 years reading secondary arms the way sailors read weather. "Crew designation," the first guard said. "Shaft 7, Crew 9, shift rotation." Mace handed over his work chit without being asked. The others did the same. A practiced motion. Nothing sudden. Nothing that required a decision from anyone wearing armor. The guard ran the chits through a portable reader. The second guard moved down the line slowly, not looking at faces, looking at hands, pockets, the seams of work suits. The scanner rig was on his back, passive mode, reading ambient chemical signatures. Mace kept his breathing even. He thought about the descent to level 2. He thought about the quota board at the bottom of the shaft and how many tons of crystite they needed to pull before the cycle ended. He thought about nothing that was actually in his mind. The second guard stopped at Halverson. Halverson was not built for invisibility. 6 feet and change of prison yard muscle, who had been on Moon 14 for 3 years, and had spent every one of those years doing the heaviest labor available because movement was the only thing that kept the cold out of his joints. He stood the way he always stood. Still, arms loose, face neutral. He had learned stillness the hard way. The guard said something in Vothrak administrative dialect that the translation chip in Mace's ear rendered as, "Step aside, compliance check." Halverson looked at Mace. Mace gave him nothing. Because giving him something, any signal, any micro-expression, would be logged by the second guard scanner as a coordination event. So he gave him nothing, and Halverson stepped aside, and the rest of the crew was waved through. Weil passed Mace on the way through the gate, did not look at him, said, just above a breath, "Cash." Mace descended to level 2 and thought about the Eastern Tunnel. The work cycle ran its course the way it always did, brutal and measured and grinding. The crystate seam on level 2 had been partially worked out 3 months ago, and what remained required precision, boring tools, and careful extraction to avoid fracturing the mineral clusters into useless fragments. The Vothrak quota did not account for seam degradation. The quota was the quota. Roque Serrano worked 3 positions down from Mace, running the primary bore with the focused attention of a man who had rebuilt the machine twice from salvaged parts and understood it better than the Vothrak technicians who had originally installed it. He was lean and gray-templed, and his hands were steadier than anyone's on Moon 14. He did not look up when Mace drifted close during a tool rotation. "Eastern Tunnel," Mace said. "Just that." Serrano adjusted the bore angle. "How long do we have?" "Don't know yet." "Then I need to know as soon as you do." Mace moved back to his position. The bore ground into frozen rock, and the crystite dust filtered up through the ventilation gaps and coated everything in a faint, blue-white shimmer that looked almost beautiful if you had not been breathing it for 4 years. He worked, he waited, he counted the hours by the rhythm of the machine. Halverson came back during the meal rotation. He walked under his own power, which was more than Mace had expected, and he sat down on the bench across from Mace with the careful movement of a man cataloging his own damage. One eye was swollen nearly shut. He held his left arm against his side in a way that suggested the ribs beneath it were not where they were supposed to be. He picked up his ration block. He ate it. Because you always eat the ration block. That was Rule 1 on Moon 14. Whatever else was happening, you eat the ration block. They had a name, Halverson said. His voice was level. Shaft 7. They said it twice, once at the start and once near the end. Mace looked at his own ration block. "They know the sector, or they know the shaft?" Weil asked from the end of the bench. He had appeared without Mace noticing, which was typical. The shaft. Specific. Level designation, too. Halverson paused. Eastern Access. The bench was quiet. Around them, the meal hall continued its low shuffle of exhausted men, and the clatter of ration dispensers, and the distant sound of the storm still hammering the exterior plating 2 levels above. Mace did the math without doing the math. The cache in the eastern tunnel of Level 1 held more than salvaged bore heads and spare filtration units. Serrano had been careful. Serrano was always careful. But careful had a limit when someone was running active scanners through adjacent corridors with a specific sector already flagged. "How long before the next scheduled maintenance inspection of the Eastern Access?" he asked Weil. 2 days, maybe 3. "Then Roque needs tonight." Weil nodded once. Halverson finished his ration block and said nothing else. There was nothing else to say. The situation was what it was. 3 levels up and in a different kind of cold, Tarek Ahn sat at his terminal in the administrative annex and stared at a pattern he could not name. He was young by Vothrak standards, junior grade, 18 months into his first field posting, assigned to incident cross-reference and anomaly flagging. It was the kind of work that senior officers considered beneath them, which meant it was done by people like Ahn, who were thorough enough to do it correctly and unimportant enough to be assigned to it. He had filed his daily report. Routine, equipment failures in the processing sector, a supply variance in ration block 7, a minor tunnel seismic event on level 3, each one individually within normal parameters. Together, a cluster. Not a pattern he could formally define, not something he could submit a deviation report on without hard evidence, but something that made the secondary arms folded across his chest shift, just slightly, before he made them still again. He pulled the incident logs back 90 days. He arranged them by sector. He arranged them by type. He rearranged them by time of occurrence. The clusters did not go away. They sharpened. Ahn did not escalate. Escalating without evidence was a procedural violation, a mark on his administrative record that would follow him through every posting for the rest of his career. The Vothrak Dominion did not reward instinct. It rewarded documentation. So he pulled the archived files instead. Background research, cross-referencing behavioral data on human prisoner populations from previous Dominion extraction sites. The archive index returned several results. He opened the first 3, standard compliance data, productivity curves, disciplinary incident rates. Then a 4th file, restricted access, amber level. He had amber clearance, barely and for limited categories. But the file had been miscatalogued, its access tag misassigned to a general research category during some administrative update he had no knowledge of. The title rendered in his translation system as Behavioral Analysis of Human Populations Under Sustained Duress. Tarek Ahn opened it. He began to read. Outside, the whiteout was dying. The wind dropped to a low moan, and then to nothing. The frozen surface of Prison Moon 14 settled back into its usual silence, the silence of a place that had never been meant for living things and would outlast every single one of them. Ahn read. His secondary arms did not move, but his primary hands, resting on the terminal edge, went very still in a way that had nothing to do with composure. Mace did not sleep. He lay on his bunk in the dark of Barracks 9 and listened to the storm finish dying above him and counted the hours by the ventilation cycle, the way the fans shifted pitch every 40 minutes when the pressure regulators adjusted for outside temperature. 4 years of that sound. He could set a clock by it if anyone on Prison Moon 14 still had a clock worth setting. When the cycle hit its 3rd shift, he got up. No lights. He moved through the barracks by memory and by the faint emergency strip along the floor that glowed a dull red and was there for tunnel collapse evacuation and nothing else. He stepped over the legs of sleeping men. Nobody stirred. The men of Shaft 7 Crew 9 had learned a long time ago that what you didn't see, you could not report. He found Serrano at the far end of the barracks, already sitting up. Mace crouched beside the bunk, 2 feet of space between their faces. He said it in the flattest voice he had. Tonight, everything in the Eastern Tunnel, 3 locations. You know which ones. Serrano looked at him for a moment, not hesitating, calculating, running the route in his head the way he always did, quietly behind his eyes. The ore conveyor runs in 6 hours, Serrano said. I know. I need 4 men who don't ask questions. Will already has them. Serrano nodded. He reached under his bunk and pulled out his work boots and began lacing them with the steady hands of a man performing a task he had rehearsed 100 times in his mind before he ever had to do it in the dark. That was the meeting. That was all of it. Thomas Weil was already moving by the time Mace made it to the junction corridor outside Barracks 9. He had 3 men with him, faces Mace recognized from the processing sector, men who had been part of Weil's smuggling routes for over a year. They were carrying nothing visible. They looked like men who could not sleep and had decided to walk the corridor until exhaustion caught up with them, which was a thing that happened on Moon 14, often enough that it had no flag value. Weil fell into step beside Mace for exactly 4 paces. Containers are already tagged, Weil said. They go out with the morning extraction load. Nobody checks Cristidor containers going toward the processing hub. They check the ones coming back. Weight variance? Packed inside the seam debris. Scanners read mineral mass, not tool mass, if the ratio is right. If it's right. Weil peeled off at the next junction without looking back. Mace kept walking. He had somewhere else to be. The operation took the rest of the night. Serrano ran it with the kind of precision that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with 4 years of moving things through places they were not supposed to be. His 4 men worked in pairs. 1 pair to the Eastern Tunnel. 1 pair staged at the Level 1 junction to run interference. Maintenance issue. A leaking pressure seal that required immediate manual reset. The kind of minor emergency that required a guard to file a physical inspection log and created a 12-minute window where attention was pointed at paperwork instead of corridors. The materials came out of the cache in wrapped sections, each section small enough to be part of something innocent. Together, they were not innocent at all. They moved through the maintenance network in the dark, through corridors that Serrano had been mentally mapping for 3 years, noting which sections of the old infrastructure the Vothrak had stopped actively monitoring because they had no active equipment there worth protecting. The moon was old. The tunnels were older. The Vothrak maintained what mattered and left the rest to entropy, and entropy had been quietly working in the prisoner's favor since the beginning. The first new cache location was a decommissioned ventilation shaft on Level 2 that still appeared on administrative infrastructure maps as active. A clerical error from a systems update 18 months ago that nobody had corrected, because correcting it required a maintenance review request, and the Vothrak maintenance review queue was 8 months long. The second was behind the primary coolant housing for the Level 1 bore array, a space that technically required Vothrak technician clearance to access, which meant no prisoner should ever have reason to be there, which meant no guard ever thought to look. The third was a collapsed section of old tunnel that the Vothrak had sealed with a temporary partition 3 years ago and never returned to. Serrano had been inside all 3 spaces before tonight. By the time the ventilation cycle shifted into its 5th pitch, Mace was back on his bunk. He did not sleep, but he closed his eyes and let his body rest and thought about the next correct thing. Field Commander Bren Callith stood in front of Overseer Prime Drath Morin's desk at the start of the administrative day and delivered his request in the clipped, documented format that Dominion protocol required. Full sector lockdown. Shaft 7. Indefinite duration pending investigation resolution. Morin listened without moving his secondary arms. When Khaleth finished, Morin was quiet for exactly the span of time it took to consult the production schedule on his terminal. Quota impact, Morin said. It was not a question. Significant. Shaft 7 accounts for a substantial portion of daily crystite yield. A lockdown variance request to Central Command requires documented incident evidence at threshold level 4 or above. Morun turned his terminal toward Kalath. Your current incident documentation is at level 2. Kalath did not move his secondary arms. Correct. Then you do not have grounds for a full lockdown. Correct. Morin looked at him. Among the Vothrak, looking directly at a subordinate without speaking was not a pause. It was a communicative act. It meant, I am aware you are about to propose something outside the standard option set. Doubled patrols, Kalath said. Mandatory crew logging at every junction in Shaft 7 and adjacent corridors. Expanded trustee placement within the active crew rotations. Within current operational parameters. Within current operational parameters. No variance required. Morun turned his terminal back. Approved. File the expanded trustee authorization through the compliance office by end of administrative period. Already drafted. Morun's secondary arms shifted a fraction. Among the Vothrak, that particular micro-movement, barely visible, immediately controlled, translated roughly as, this subordinate is either very good or about to be very expensive. Kalath left the office and went directly to the compliance processing room, where 2 prisoner files were already open on the secondary terminal. 2 men currently assigned to Shaft 7 crew rotations. Their compliance histories were clean, which was exactly what made them useful. Men with disciplinary marks got watched by other prisoners. Clean records meant invisibility in both directions. He authorized the trustee expansion, closed the files, and went to inspect the doubled patrol assignments personally. He did not delegate inspection. That was the thing about Khaleth that made him different from every other Vothrak officer on Moon 14. He checked. The new patrol circuit hit Shaft 7's Level 1 corridor 6 hours later. Burke Halverson was in the maintenance corridor off Junction 4 when the patrol came around the corner. He was moving a sealed equipment crate. His left arm was strapped tight against his side under his work suit. The ribs were cracked, not broken, and he had decided that information was his alone. And he was moving the crate with his right arm and his body weight, slow and deliberate, the way a man does a job that hurts but needs doing. The patrol leader stopped 4 meters away. 2 guards behind him. Standard armor. No scanner rig on this rotation. The scanner rigs were assigned to the outer junction sweeps. Prisoner, identify and state task. Halverson set the crate down. He reached into his chest pocket and produced his work chit with his right hand. Halverson Burke, Crew 9, maintenance reassignment. Pressure seal fault in Junction 4 secondary housing. The guard took the chit. Read it. The reassignment was logged. Will had made sure of that 6 hours ago through a prisoner work order request that was entirely legitimate and entirely boring and had been processed by the administrative compliance system without a flag because pressure seal faults in Junction 4 secondary housing were a recurring issue that maintenance crews were routinely redirected to address. The guard handed the chit back. He looked at the crate. Contents. Replacement seal components. Standard housing kit. The guard looked at the crate for another moment. He did not open it. Opening it required a physical inspection authorization that needed to be filed before the inspection occurred, not after. A procedural protection originally designed to prevent guards from conducting unauthorized searches of Vothrak administrative property that had never been revised to account for prisoner equipment in maintenance corridors. The patrol moved on. Halverson waited until the sound of their boots faded completely. Then he picked up the crate and kept moving. The crate held nothing but replacement seal components. The real materials had gone through the ore conveyor 20 minutes earlier, exactly as Weil had said they would. Calith reviewed the patrol report that evening. He read Halverson's name, and he read the location, and he opened the compliance file and added a second deviation notation beneath the first. Same prisoner, different corridor, adjacent sector. He did not escalate. Escalation required threshold documentation. He was at level 2. He needed level 4. He was building toward it. Methodically. The way the Dominion built everything. Documented step by documented step, until the structure was solid enough to act on without procedural risk. He closed the file and moved to the trustee network report. 2 new assets placed. Neither had reported yet. That was expected. New trustees needed time to establish credibility within crew social structures before their observations carried signal value. Calith had patience. Patience was a procedural virtue. Calith had no idea what was happening in Shaft 7, but he knew things were out of place, and he was constructing, brick by brick, the documentation required to act on it. That was what made him dangerous. Not anger, not cruelty. Patience and paperwork, and the absolute certainty that the system he served would eventually give him what he needed. Weil found Mace in the meal hall at the end of the second work cycle and sat across from him without a tray. "Third location," Weil said. Mace ate. "The maintenance tunnel. They added it to the expanded patrol circuit. New sweep, starts tomorrow morning." Mace set his utensil down. He looked at the surface of the table. Old alloy, scratched and pitted. The kind of surface that recorded years of use without anyone intending it to. "How close is the nearest checkpoint to the tunnel entrance?" "1 junction. Maybe 2 if the patrol takes the long route." "They'll take the short route. Calith is running the assignments personally." Weil said nothing. That was confirmation enough. "Tell Roque," Mace said. "If the patrol clears the first checkpoint and keeps moving toward the tunnel, he destroys it. Everything." Weil looked at him, not questioning, weighing. "That's 8 months of work. It's 8 months of work, or it's evidence that ends everything." Weil picked up a ration block from the dispenser tray on the table, even though it was not his. He ate it slowly. "Roque's not going to like it." "Roque already knows that's the answer." Weil finished the ration block and left without looking back. Mace sat alone for another few minutes. Around him, the meal hall moved through its end-of-cycle shuffle. Men too tired to talk, too cold to sit still for long, too worn down to be anything but the sum of the next necessary action. 4 years of that. 4 years of eating what was put in front of you and doing what needed doing, and not asking whether it was going to work, because asking that question was a luxury that Prison Moon 14 did not offer. He picked up his utensil and finished eating. Tarek On had read the document 3 times, the first time for content, the second time for methodology, the third time because he needed to be certain he was not constructing a pattern from noise, which was a failure mode his training had drilled into him repeatedly, the danger of finding shapes in data that wanted to have shapes. But the pattern was not constructed. It was there. Every cluster in his incident logs mapped to a documented behavioral marker. Equipment failures that were too consistent to be entropy. Patrol deviations that had no administrative explanation. A trustee report from 6 weeks ago that he had logged as low value, a prisoner seen in the wrong corridor, twice, that now read as early-stage network probing activity. He had written the memo, 1 page. He had not sent it. He pulled up the DCA relay authorization protocols instead. The Dominion Containment Array, 6 orbital platforms, planetary denial capability, full surface sterilization on authorization from Overseer Prime level and above. He had never had reason to look at the protocols before. It was not part of his incident cross-reference function. It was infrastructure documentation, filed under administrative operations, accessible at his clearance level, because nobody had thought to restrict it further. He read through the authorization sequence: hardwired command relay, physical terminal, sub-level 3 of the central processing hub. He pulled up the central processing hub layout. Sub-level 3 had a security complement of 4 guards on rotating shift. The terminal itself had a 2-key authorization requirement: Overseer Prime Biometric, and a secondary administrative confirm from a senior officer. The room was logged as a restricted access zone, but the access log showed the last physical inspection of the terminal had been, he checked the date, long enough ago that the inspection itself was overdue for a compliance review. On sat back. He thought about the report, about the documented behavioral escalation curve, about where Moon 14's prisoner population sat on that curve right now. Then he thought about the layout of sub-level 3 relative to the sectors flagged in his incident clusters. 3 corridors. That was the distance between the area of highest anomalous activity and the room that controlled whether this moon lived or died. He opened the memo he had not sent. He stared at it. His secondary arms were perfectly still, but his primary hands pressed flat against the terminal edge with a pressure that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with a junior officer who had just understood, fully and completely, that he was looking at something his entire chain of command had not yet seen. He did not send the memo. He needed more. Procedure required more. He started a new document, longer this time, and he began to build the case the only way the Vothric Dominion knew how to receive one. Slowly, documented, brick by brick. Outside his terminal window, the frozen surface of prison Moon 14 reflected the distant light of Vorith in cold silence. 3 corridors. The lockdown order came through at the start of the administrative period, the way all Vothrak decisions came. Documented, authorized, filed in triplicate before a single boot moved. Mace heard it in the sound of the patrol pattern changing. Not an announcement. Just the rhythm of boots in the corridor outside Barracks 9, shifting from the standard 4-count rotation to something denser, closer together, overlapping. He had been listening to patrol rhythms for 4 years. He knew what tightening sounded like before it had a name. He sat up on his bunk. Across the barracks, men were already awake, not because they had heard anything specific, because they had learned to sleep the way animals sleep in places where predators exist. 1 level below the surface, ready. Whale was sitting on his bunk with his hands flat on his knees. He was looking at the door. He was also looking at the man 2 bunks down from the door, a prisoner from Crew 12, who had transferred into Shaft 7's rotation 3 weeks ago, and whose name Weil had checked twice against the original crew manifest and found clean both times, which meant nothing. Clean records were exactly what Kalath would select for. The man from Crew 12 coughed and turned over in his bunk. Weil looked at Mace, said nothing. Mace stood. He pulled on his work boots. He moved to the water dispenser at the far end of the barracks and filled his cup and drank it standing with his back to the room, which put his face toward the wall and his voice low enough that it carried to Weil and no further. "Count the room." Weil was already doing it. Mace finished the water. He went back to his bunk and sat down and looked at the floor. In his peripheral vision, he watched the man from Crew 12. The man did not move again, did not look at anyone, did not do anything that could be flagged as behavior. That was the problem with the trustee system. It did not require action to function. It only required presence. The knowledge that someone in the room might be reporting was enough to change what the room said, how it moved, what it decided. Kalath had not broken their network with the trustees. He had made the network doubt itself, which was a different kind of damage, and in some ways worse. A guard appeared in the barracks doorway, standard armor, secondary arms folded. Crew 9. Shift rotation suspended. confinement to assigned barracks until further administrative notice. He left without waiting for acknowledgement. The barracks was silent for a long moment after the sound of his boots faded. Then Halverson, from the far end of the room, picked up his ration block from the previous cycle that he had not finished, and ate the remainder of it without expression. It was such a specific and deliberate act of normalcy that 3 other men reached for their own unfinished rations almost immediately, the way men do when someone they trust demonstrates what the next thing should be. Mace watched this. Then he looked at the wall beside his bunk. Behind the wall, 14 centimeters into the infrastructure housing, ran a pressure pipe that Serrano had tapped 8 months ago. 3 knocks meant one thing. It had always meant one thing. The signal did not require explanation because explanations were what got people caught. He did not knock yet. He waited. Calath's patrol reached the first checkpoint on the route toward the maintenance tunnel 40 minutes into the lockdown. Mace felt it before he knew it. Something in the air pressure of the barracks, a barely perceptible shift that meant a bulkhead somewhere in the adjacent network had sealed. Serrano was already moving then, already in position. Mace knocked 3 times on the wall beside his bunk. The sound was quiet. Several men in the barracks heard it. None of them looked at the wall. In a maintenance tunnel on level 1, Roque Serrano pressed the igniter. The thermite compound, built over 8 months from modified bore head components, welding compound, and oxidizing agents that individually appeared on no contraband list because individually they were used in standard mining operations, caught in under 2 seconds, and burned at a temperature that had no business existing in a frozen tunnel on a prison moon. 4 minutes. That was all it took. He stood with his back against the tunnel wall 3 meters from the burn point, eyes closed against the light, one hand resting flat on the wall because the rock transmitted the heat faintly, and he wanted to feel it until it stopped. The components in that cache had taken longer to build than anything else in the network. Precision-modified relay switches that could interface with Vothrak administrative infrastructure, the kind of thing that would have cut their timeline in the next phase by a significant margin. Gone now. The burn cooled. The tunnel went dark again. Serrano opened his eyes and looked at the slag, and then looked away from it, and picked up his position, and waited for what came next. When the patrol arrived at the tunnel entrance 4 minutes later, they found clean rock and a faint smell of mineral oxidation that in a crystite mining environment was not remarkable enough to flag. They logged it clear and moved on. Serrano heard their boots pass. He sat in the dark for a moment after the sound died. Then he reached into his kit and checked the remaining components he had brought from the second cache location, the ones that were still intact, still functional, still enough to do what needed doing if everything else held. Not everything he had planned. Enough. He moved. Weil triggered the power failure at the 47th minute of the lockdown. It was not an explosion. It was not dramatic. Just a modified Bohr relay in the Junction 7 corridor, housing registered an overload fault and pulled power from the primary lighting grid across a 60-meter section of the Shaft 7 upper approach. Emergency strips activated. Dull red, enough to navigate by, not enough to run active scanner equipment. The fault read on every Vothrak administrative terminal as equipment malfunction. Category 3, non-critical, requiring maintenance assessment. It also pulled 4 patrol units from the lockdown perimeter toward the fault location to conduct the mandatory physical inspection that equipment malfunction protocol required. 4 units off the perimeter, for however long the inspection took. Weil was back on his bunk before the emergency strips finished warming up. Halverson took his 12 men into the maintenance tunnels through an access point behind the Level 1 coolant housing at the 49th minute. They moved single file. No lights beyond the faint chemical glow strips that Serrano had placed at junction points weeks ago. Small enough to look like bioluminescent mineral deposits to anyone who did not know what they were looking at, bright enough to navigate by if you knew the route. The tunnels were narrow. The cold was a different quality down here, away from the heating conduits. Dry and absolute, the kind of cold that did not sting, but simply pressed. Halverson did not speak. He moved, and the men behind him moved, and the tunnel absorbed the sound of them, the way old rock absorbs everything, indifferently, completely. Twice they stopped. The first time because a patrol unit was audible through a shared wall, boots, and the low-frequency hum of armor. And they pressed flat and waited until the sound moved away and did not come back. The second time because the tunnel branched, and the left branch was where the map said to go, and the left branch had a sealed bulkhead across it that had not been on any map because Serrano had installed it 2 months ago and had not told anyone outside the core network because information was weight, and weight got people killed. Halverson looked at the bulkhead. He looked at the man behind him, one of Weil's processing sector contacts, a former dock engineer named Pruitt, who had been on Moon 14 for 5 years and who had the specific quality of competence that expressed itself as absolute silence in difficult situations. Pruitt looked at the bulkhead. He reached into the lining of his worksuit and produced a manual release key that Serrano had cut from a bore head housing 6 weeks ago and distributed to exactly 3 people, of whom Halverson was one and Pruitt was another. The bulkhead opened. They went through. Mace moved for sub-level 3 at the 51st minute. He went alone for the first 4 corridors because the route required it. A single person moving through a maintenance access that registered on Vothrak infrastructure maps as a decommissioned ventilation shaft could be explained as a disoriented prisoner separated from a work crew. 2 people in a decommissioned shaft was a different flag entirely. The cold was significant here. The ventilation shaft had not been heated since it was decommissioned, and the temperature inside it sat at a level that made breathing produce a visible fog that he kept low by breathing through his nose and keeping his pace steady. Moving generated heat. Stopping was the enemy. He had walked sections of this route in pieces over 8 months, never the full sequence. Always one section, then back, then a different section on a different day, so that no single transit could be read as directional movement. The route existed in its complete form only in his head. He found it accurate. 4 corridors, a vertical access ladder that descended through a gap in the infrastructure housing that the Vothrak maps listed as a sealed mechanical void. It was not sealed. It had not been sealed for 7 months, since Serrano had quietly removed the original partition and replaced it with a facsimile constructed from decommissioned hull plating that looked correct from the outside and was held in place by 2 manual clips accessible only from inside the shaft. He went down the ladder. Sub-level 3. The corridor was lit at standard administrative level. White strips, full power, untouched by the Junction 7 outage. It felt almost wrong after the maintenance tunnels. Too bright, too clean. The kind of clean that belonged to people who had never needed to navigate by chemical glow strips in the dark. 2 guards at the far end of the corridor, outside the relay terminal room. Standard armor. Secondary arms folded in the low alert position. He did not have a weapon. He had 4 men who came through the secondary access point from the coolant housing route 30 seconds behind him. Men who had been separately routed here by Weil weeks ago as processing sector maintenance workers, whose presence in sub-level 3 on a work order for coolant housing inspection was documented and legitimate, and had been filed 3 days ago when none of this had officially started. Mace fell into step with them as they crossed the corridor toward the checkpoint. The guards checked the work order. The work order was clean. The maintenance team entered the coolant housing access room adjacent to the relay terminal. The relay terminal room had a connecting internal access panel, a design feature installed for emergency engineering access that appeared in the original construction blueprints that Serrano had found in a decommissioned data terminal on Level 3 14 months ago and had memorized and then destroyed. Mace was inside the relay terminal room before the guards in the corridor had finished logging the maintenance team's entry. The terminal was exactly where the blueprint said it would be. Large, gray, the kind of hardware that had been built to last for decades, and looked it, worn at the edges, indicator lights steady, the authentication console slightly recessed into the housing in a way that suggested it had been designed for four-handed Vuthrak operation. Mace had spent 3 weeks practicing the sequence on a physical mock-up that Serrano had built from scavenged components in a decommissioned tunnel section. He entered the partial authorization sequence. Not the full sequence, not the firing command. The deadlock, a partial input that the system's authentication protocol could not resolve without a complete biometric confirm that only a Dominion Overseer Prime could provide. Without that, confirm the system could not complete the sequence. Without completing or canceling the sequence, the system could not accept a new input. Without accepting a new input, the remote deactivation request from Dominion Central Command would queue and never process. The terminal accepted the partial sequence. A single amber indicator light replaced the standard green across the authorization console. The orbital platforms above Prison Moon 14 sat live and uncontrollable and would continue to sit that way until a Dominion engineering team with specialized reset equipment arrived and performed a full physical restoration of the authentication chain. Days of work, equipment that was not on this moon. Mace looked at the amber light for a moment. Then he sat down in front of the communications array built into the same console and began to broadcast. Tarek On ran. It was undignified. It was a visible display of agitation that any Vuthrak officer observing him would have noted and filed. He did not care. He had stopped caring about that somewhere between reading the report for the 3rd time and understanding what the cluster maps meant when you laid them over the sub-level 3 layout. He had sent the memo to Morin 12 minutes ago. Direct channel, priority flag, which was itself a procedural deviation that would appear on his record. He had also sent a copy to Kalath's terminal, knowing Kalath was already in the tunnel network and might not receive it in time to act on it. He reached sub-level 3 to find Morin already there with a security detail, standing in front of the sealed relay terminal room door with his secondary arms fully extended. An involuntary display that among the Vuthrak indicated a level of agitation that had bypassed conscious control entirely. On had never seen a senior officer's secondary arms fully extended before. Morin turned to look at him. "You filed this report?" "Yes." "You filed it 23 minutes ago." "Yes." Morin looked at the sealed door. "The terminal is inside." "I know." The door did not open. Behind it, the sound of a broadcast transmission was faintly audible through the housing. A human voice speaking in Galactic Standard, calm and flat and continuous, reading from a document that On recognized before he could make out the specific words, because he had read that document himself not long ago, and the cadence of it was by now familiar to him. Morin reached for the door and found it sealed from the inside by the same manual clip system that should not have been possible to access from this side of the housing and was not supposed to exist in an administrative relay room. It existed. Kalath's voice came through Morin's comm unit, fragmented. The tunnel acoustics made it difficult to resolve. What came through clearly was, "The route is modified. We cannot." And then something that was not words, and then silence. On stood in the corridor. He understood the full shape of it now. Not the individual incidents, but the system beneath them, built slowly over years in a place where the builders had nothing except time, suffering, and each other. His training had taught him to recognize threat patterns as structures with internal logic and purpose. This was not the result of a single brilliant plan. It had been built piece by piece, through thousands of necessary decisions made by people trying to survive. The broadcast continued behind the sealed door. The door opened 17 minutes later. Not because the security detail forced it, because Mace opened it from the inside, which was a thing he could do because he had locked it, and he still had the key. He stepped into the corridor. He was lean and gray-faced, and his hands were scarred in the specific pattern that 4 years of Christite handling produced, and he looked at Morun with the flat attention of a man who had already done everything he came here to do, and was now simply present for what came next. Morun's secondary arms were still extended. He did not speak. 4 men came out of the relay room behind Mace. Then Halverson, ducking slightly through the doorframe, his left arm still held close to his side. On was standing at the edge of the security detail. Not part of it, just present. He was the only one who had understood where this was going before it happened, and understanding had not been enough to stop it. Mace looked at him. On looked back. 3 meters of corridor between them. The security detail did not move. Morun had not given an order, and without an order from Overseer Prime level, the security protocol did not specify an action for this precise situation. Prisoner outside secured relay room, broadcast transmitted, terminal in deadlock, no active weapon displayed, because this precise situation was not in the protocol. The Vothrak had written protocols for every situation they had imagined. They had not imagined this one. Kalath had spent the lockdown moving through the tunnel network, trying to intercept the prisoners before they reached sub-level 3. He navigated by administrative maps that described a tunnel system, bearing only a partial resemblance to the actual tunnels. Close enough to follow, not close enough to trust. Bulkheads where corridors should have been. Ventilation rerouted so that the pressure differentials that normally indicated direction in a complex underground network pointed consistently wrong. 3 times he had backtracked. 3 times the backtrack route had been modified behind him. His patrol unit was intact. His officers were uninjured. They had encountered no resistance in the conventional sense, no confrontation, no ambush, no engagement. They had simply been walked, methodically and without malice, into a section of tunnel infrastructure that no longer connected to anywhere useful. He requested a status report from the sub-level 3 security detail. The response he received told him everything. He stood in the tunnel for a moment. The ceiling was low here. He had to angle his secondary arms differently than normal, a physical discomfort he had been managing since he arrived. The cold was significant. Emergency lighting only. He opened his administrative terminal. Then he filed a formal cessation of security operation notice. Case reference number, operational parameters, personnel status, reason for cessation. He completed every required field. He filed it to the administrative record, where it would sit permanently, regardless of what happened next. The Galactic Council response would take time. That was the nature of interstellar bureaucracy. Distance, procedure, the slow machinery of oversight that had failed to see Moon 14 for years, precisely because it was designed to process requests rather than find violations that no one had reported. But the broadcast had gone to every council monitoring station in the sector. The document was transmitted. The production records were attached. 4 years of Christite yield data proving that Moon 14 was not a rehabilitation labor site, as the Dominion had reported to the Galactic Council, but a forced extraction prison operating far outside authorized compliance thresholds. Category 3 violation. Associate signatory status at risk. The trade corridor licenses, the commodity market access, The FTL route permissions that the Vothrak Dominion's economy moved through like blood through veins. Too expensive to ignore, too public to quietly resolve. Too late to stop. Morin was detained in the administrative office that had been his for 3 years. Human guards stood outside the door now, processing sector workers and tunnel crews who had spent years taking orders from the Vothrak administration and were now following them from Mace instead. Calith was there as well, confined under guard in the adjacent administrative wing. He sat at his own desk and looked at his own terminal and did not speak. His secondary arms were folded. The control had returned. Morin was Vothrak enough for that, even now. But the fold was too tight, held with the specific rigidity of a man using discipline as the last available wall between himself and something he did not have a category for. Serrano was in the tunnel intersection he had chosen as his position at the start of the operation. He had not left it. When Weil found him, he was sitting with his back against the wall and the remaining components from the second cache arranged in front of him with the careful organization of a man who needed his hands to be doing something specific. He looked up when Weil crouched in front of him and said nothing, and Weil said nothing, and after a moment, Serrano began packing the components back into the kit with the same careful organization. Some of the men who had gone through the maintenance tunnels with Halverson had not made it to the end of the route, not from combat, from the cold, from a tunnel section that had partially collapsed under the stress of a rerouted ventilation pressure differential that Serrano had not fully anticipated, from the specific cost of moving too fast in the dark through spaces that were not built for humans and had never pretended otherwise. Mace learned their names from Halverson at the end. He held each one for a moment, in the way you hold something that has weight and cannot be put down cleanly. Then he went back to what needed doing. The prison still needed power, heat, ventilation. The mining equipment still had to run, though now only for survival quotas instead of Dominion extraction targets. Until the Galactic Council arrived, someone had to keep Moon 14 alive. On was still in the corridor outside Sub-Level 3 when Mace came back through. He had not been detained. No one had formally classified his status in the new order of things on Prison Moon 14, which left him in a procedural gap that would have been professionally distressing under normal circumstances. These were not normal circumstances, and he had stopped expecting them to resolve into something his training had prepared him for. Mace stopped. They looked at each other. Mace looked at him with the flat, measuring attention that was apparently just how the man looked at the world. Not cold, not warm, just present. Accounting for what was in front of him. Then he moved past On without a word. On stood alone in the corridor. He had read the report. He had cross-referenced the data. He had written the memo and run through the corridors and arrived at a sealed door with a senior officer whose secondary arms had lost their composure. He had done everything his training and his instincts and his procedure had told him to do. He had been right about everything, and it had not mattered. The report was right. It had always been right. The report had been written by people who understood something specific about human beings. That humans placed under sustained duress became dangerous in ways most systems failed to predict until it was already too late. That the conditions designed to break them had a threshold passed, which they stopped breaking and started building, organizing, adapting, reshaping the systems around them for survival. It had all been there, clearly, in plain language, filed, archived, miscatalogued, and left unread, while Moon 14 continued operating under the exact conditions the report had identified as dangerous long before the point of no return.